Captain John Beeling held the ordnance officer's report in his hands at 9 p.m. on July 28, 1967. The assessment was unambiguous. The AN-M65 bombs were a decade old, improperly stored, and represented an extreme safety hazard to USS Forrestal and her 5,400 crew members. Jettisoning them meant scrubbing the next day's combat mission, the Atlantic Fleet's chance to prove themselves equal to their Pacific counterparts. 21 hours later, 94 seconds of fire would kill 134 men and nearly sink the world's first supercarrier. But the path to that catastrophe had been paved long before Captain Beeling received that report. The decisions, the shortcuts, the institutional pressures that would converge on the morning of July 29th had been building for months. And as we'll see, every warning sign was documented, every risk was identified, and every expert who raised concerns would be proven catastrophically right. The USS Forrestal was the embodiment of American naval supremacy. Commissioned in 1955, she was the world's first supercarrier, a floating city displacing 78,000 tons, stretching 1,039 feet from bow to stern. Her crew of 5,400 sailors and officers operated a vessel capable of launching 85 aircraft from her angled flight deck, a British innovation that revolutionized carrier operations. By 1967, the Forrestal had become a symbol of Atlantic Fleet capability. Meanwhile, Pacific Fleet carriers had been rotating through Yankee Station in the Gulf of Tonkin since 1964, conducting sustained combat operations against North Vietnam. The Pacific Fleet had earned its combat credentials. The Atlantic Fleet had not. This created an unspoken pressure throughout the Atlantic Fleet command structure. When Forrestal received orders to deploy to Yankee Station, it wasn't just another combat deployment. It was the Atlantic Fleet's opportunity to demonstrate. They were every bit as capable, as aggressive, as mission-ready as their Pacific counterparts. Captain John Beeling understood this pressure intimately. A career naval officer with decades of experience, he had taken command of Forrestal, knowing that every decision would be scrutinized, every hesitation would be noted, every delay would be questioned. The Pacific Fleet carriers had established a brutal operational tempo, launching strikes, recovering aircraft, rearming, refueling, and launching again in relentless cycles. Beeling knew his crew would be measured against that standard. The Forrestal departed Norfolk, Virginia in early June 1967. After completing required inspections and a show of force deployment to Brazil, she sailed east around the Horn of Africa, stopped at Naval Air Station Cuby Point in the Philippines, and arrived at Yankee Station on July 25, 1967. However, from the moment Forrestal began combat operations, problems emerged that Captain Beeling couldn't fully control. The first issue was ammunition supply. The intensity of the air campaign against North Vietnam had created critical shortages of modern ordnance. The Navy's bombing operations were expending Mark 83 1,000-pound bombs faster than American factories could produce them. This created a desperate scramble for alternative munitions from any available source. On July 28th, the day before the disaster, the ammunition ship USS Diamond Head resupplied Forrestal with ordnance that included 16 AN-M65A1 bombs. These weapons, nicknamed Fat Boys because of their short, rotund shape, were relics from the Korean War era. More than a decade old, they had spent years exposed to heat and humidity in improper storage conditions on Okinawa and Guam, before being stored in open-air Quonset huts at a disused ammunition dump on the periphery of Subic Bay Naval Base. The AN-M65 bombs were fundamentally different from modern munitions. Unlike the thick-cased Mark 83 bombs filled with stable composition H6 explosive, the AN-M65s were thin-skinned and filled with composition B, an older explosive compound with significantly greater sensitivity to shock and heat. When Captain Belling's ordnance officer inspected these bombs, his assessment was immediate and unequivocal. These weapons were dangerous. Their age, their storage history, their explosive composition, everything about them represented an unacceptable risk to the ship and crew. His recommendation was clear: jettison them immediately. But jettisoning 16 1,000-pound bombs meant one thing: scrubbing the next day's Alpha Strike mission. Captain Belling faced an impossible choice: accept the ordnance officer's recommendation, prioritize crew safety, and explain to Admiral Harvey Lanham why Forrestal, the Atlantic Fleet's flagship on Yankee Station, couldn't execute its assigned combat mission, or accept the risk, trust that the bombs would function as designed, and prove that Atlantic Fleet carriers could maintain the same operational tempo as their Pacific counterparts. Meanwhile, another problem was developing that Captain Belling knew nothing about. 4 weeks earlier, on June 30th, Forrestal's Weapons Coordination Board had convened a meeting with members of the Weapons Planning Board to discuss operational efficiency. The issue was simple. Launching aircraft from the carrier's steam catapults sometimes experienced delays when ordnance personnel had difficulty connecting the electrical pigtail, the cable that armed weapons systems, at the catapult itself. The boards reached a decision. They would deviate from standard procedure and allow ordnance personnel to connect pigtails in the pack, meaning on the aircraft while still parked on the flight deck, rather than waiting until the aircraft was positioned at the catapult for launch. This would eliminate the delay. A memorandum documenting this decision was written on July 8th and circulated to the ship's operations officer. However, it was never communicated to Captain Belling, who was required by Navy regulations to personally approve all deviations from standard weapons handling procedures. The ordnance crew, unaware that their decision lacked proper authorization, immediately implemented the new procedure. By late July, connecting pigtails early had become routine practice on Forrestal's flight deck. This seemingly minor procedural change had profound implications. Standard procedure required the TER pin, a safety device preventing accidental rocket ignition, to remain in place until the aircraft reached the catapult. But, with pigtails connected early, ordnance crews began removing TER pins early as well, reasoning that the pins would need to come out eventually anyway. Instead, what this meant was that armed rockets were now electrically live while aircraft sat crowded together on the flight deck, waiting their turn for launch. Any electrical surge, any stray signal, any malfunction in the complex wiring systems could potentially fire a rocket while surrounded by other fully fueled, fully armed aircraft. And as we'll discover, that's exactly what happened. By the morning of July 29th, these two critical decisions, accepting the old bombs and implementing unauthorized electrical connection procedures, had placed USS Forrestal in a configuration that multiple safety systems had been specifically designed to prevent. The first 4 days of combat operations had gone remarkably well. Forrestal's aircraft flew more than 150 sorties over North Vietnam without losing a single plane. The crew was hitting their stride. the Atlantic Fleet was proving itself. Captain Belling had reason to feel vindicated in his decision. On the morning of July 29th, Forrestal prepared for its second Alpha Strike of the day. An Alpha Strike was the carrier's maximum effort, launching as many attack aircraft as possible in a concentrated strike package designed to overwhelm enemy defenses. By 10:45 a.m. local time, the aft portion of Forrestal's flight deck was a carefully choreographed chaos. 27 aircraft were spotted, positioned and prepared for launch. 7 F-4B Phantom fighter jets, 20 A-4E Skyhawk attack aircraft, all fully fueled with JP-5 jet fuel, all fully armed with combinations of iron bombs, precision missiles, and Zuni rocket pods. The density of aircraft on the deck was extraordinary. Sailors moving between planes had barely walking room. Fuel lines snaked across the deck. Ordnance technicians made final checks. Pilots climbed into cockpits and began pre-flight procedures. The ship hummed with purposeful activity. At 10:50 a.m., Forrestal commenced early launch of 2 Ka-3B tanker aircraft, an EA-1 electronic warfare plane, and an E-2A early warning aircraft. These would be airborne before the main strike package, providing support for the incoming bombers. However, on the extreme starboard quarter of the flight deck, an F-4B Phantom numbered 110 sat with its pilot, Lieutenant Commander Jim Bangert of Fighter Squadron 11, running through his pre-start checklist. At approximately 10:51 a.m., Lieutenant Commander Bangert switched his aircraft from external power, provided by a ground generator, to internal power, using the plane's own electrical system. This power transition should have been routine. Thousands of such transitions occurred daily across the Navy's carrier fleet. But on this morning, on this aircraft, multiple electrical malfunctions occurred simultaneously. A stray electrical surge, investigators would later debate whether it came from the power transition, the ship's AN/SPS-43 search radar, or faulty wiring in the weapons systems, traveled through the rocket pod circuitry to one of the 4 5-inch Mark 32 Zuni unguided rockets loaded on the F-4B's port inboard station. The Zuni rocket motor ignited. The rocket fired across the flight deck. It traveled approximately 100 feet in less than 1 second, crossing the crowded deck at ballistic velocity, and struck A-4E Skyhawk number 405, piloted by Lieutenant Commander Fred White. The Zuni's warhead penetrated the Skyhawk's external fuel tank, rupturing it instantly. 400 gallons of JP-5 jet fuel exploded outward and downward, spraying across the flight deck and igniting on contact with the rocket's exhaust flame. The time was 10:51 a.m. The fire had begun. Forrestal's Specialized Damage Control Team 8, led by Chief Aviation Bosun's mate Gerald Farrier, had received advanced flight deck firefighting training. They were the ship's first line of defense against exactly this type of emergency. Their response was immediate and by the book. 54 seconds after the initial fire started, Chief Farrier reached the burning fuel with a handheld fire extinguisher and began attacking the flames. His team deployed behind him, pulling fire hoses across the deck, preparing to establish a foam barrier that would smother the burning fuel. But Farrier and his team saw something that turned their training into terror. Lying in the pool of burning fuel, partially obscured by flames, was a 1,000-pound AN-M65 bomb. It had fallen from one of the A-4E Skyhawks when the Zuni impact shook the aircraft. The thin-skinned bomb, filled with heat-sensitive Composition B explosive, was now lying directly in a fuel fire, burning at temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Meanwhile, across the flight deck, pilots were scrambling from their cockpits. Lieutenant Commander John McCain, sitting in A4E number 416, directly next to the aircraft that had been struck, saw the fuel fire erupt around his plane. He popped his canopy, climbed out onto the aircraft's refueling probe, and dropped to the deck as flames licked at his aircraft. Other pilots weren't as fortunate. Lieutenant Commander Fred White, whose aircraft had been struck by the Zuni rocket, was killed instantly. When the fuel explosion engulfed his cockpit, the clock was running. Chief Farrier knew the bomb was heating. He knew the explosive compound inside would reach detonation temperature. But he also knew that every second he could delay that detonation gave more sailors time to escape, gave the fire teams time to establish foam coverage, gave the ship time to prepare. He stayed at the fire, directing his extinguisher at the burning bomb, trying desperately to cool it. 94 seconds after the fire started, the bomb detonated. The explosion was catastrophic. The 1,000-pound warhead, superheated to detonation temperature, exploded with a blast radius that instantly killed Chief Farrier and every member of his fire team. The explosion also detonated or catastrophically damaged multiple other bombs and rockets on nearby aircraft. A chain reaction began. Over the next 3 minutes, 7 more major explosions tore through the aft flight deck. Each detonation was another 1,000-pound or 750-pound bomb cooking off in the fuel fires. Each explosion created shrapnel that punctured more fuel tanks, detonated more ordnance, and spread the fires further. The flight deck became an apocalyptic landscape. Aircraft were blown apart, their fragments scattered across the deck and into the sea. Massive holes were torn through the steel deck plating. Burning fuel poured through these holes into the hangar deck below and into berthing compartments where off-duty sailors were sleeping. However, the disaster below decks would prove even more deadly than the flight deck catastrophe. When the bombs exploded and tore holes through the flight deck, burning jet fuel didn't just spread across the surface. It poured like a flaming waterfall into the spaces below. The aft hangar deck, where aircraft maintenance was conducted, was suddenly engulfed in fire. Berthing compartments, where night shift crew members were sleeping after working through the previous night, became death traps. 50 sailors died in their bunks, killed by fire, smoke, or explosion before they could even wake. They had survived the Vietnam War's combat operations only to die in their sleep aboard what should have been the safest place in the combat zone. The total casualty count would eventually reach 134 killed and 161 injured. But at 10:52 a.m., in the immediate aftermath of the first explosion, no one knew how many were dead or how many more would die in the minutes ahead. What they knew was that the ship was on fire. Explosions were continuing, and USS Forrestal, 78,000 tons of steel, aviation fuel, and high explosives, was minutes away from sinking to the bottom of the Gulf of Tonkin. If you're finding this level of detail valuable, please consider subscribing to the channel. This kind of deep research takes significant time, and your support helps make these videos possible. Commander Mervyn Rowland, Forrestal's chief engineering officer, was in the damage control center when the first reports arrived. Fire on the flight deck, multiple casualties, explosions continuing. His immediate assessment was grim but clear. This was the worst-case scenario every carrier sailor trained for but hoped never to face. Within minutes, 3 catastrophic problems became apparent. Each one, if not solved immediately, would result in the total loss of the ship and all hands. The first problem was stability. Forrestal's damage control teams were pumping millions of gallons of seawater onto the fires, following standard firefighting doctrine. However, all that water was accumulating in the ship's compartments, and because the fires were concentrated on the starboard aft section, the water accumulation was asymmetric. The ship began listing to port. Aircraft carriers are inherently top-heavy by design. The flight deck and island superstructure create enormous weight high above the waterline. This makes carriers more susceptible to capsizing than other warship types. As the list increased, Forrestal approached the angle of no return, the point beyond which the ship would continue rolling until it turned turtle and sank. Commander Rowland made an instantaneous decision that saved the ship. He ordered all fuel oil in the starboard tanks pumped to port tanks. Forrestal wasn't nuclear-powered like her later sister ships. She ran on bunker fuel oil, thick, heavy petroleum stored in massive tanks throughout the hull. By shifting thousands of tons of fuel oil to the port side, Rowland created a counterweight that stopped the list and prevented capsizing. Meanwhile, the second crisis was developing in the ship's fuel systems. The ship's JP-5 aviation fuel lines ran throughout Forrestal, feeding the aircraft fuel stations on the flight deck and hangar deck. These lines, made of aluminum and running through spaces now engulfed in fire, were in danger of rupturing. If the fuel lines failed, they would spray aviation fuel directly into the fires, creating an unstoppable inferno that would consume the entire ship. Rowland ordered the entire fuel system purged with inert carbon dioxide gas. This meant shutting down all fuel flow, venting the lines, and then filling them with CO2. To prevent any possibility of fuel ignition, even if the lines were breached by fire or explosion. The procedure had never been done under combat conditions. It required coordination across dozens of damage control stations throughout a ship that was simultaneously on fire, exploding, and listing. His damage control teams executed flawlessly. The fuel system was purged. The lines were secured. That threat was neutralized. But then, the third crisis emerged, and this one was potentially the most catastrophic of all. The fires on the hangar deck were advancing toward the ship's 750-gallon liquid oxygen tank. This tank supplied oxygen to refill the oxygen bottles that pilots wore during high-altitude combat missions. Liquid oxygen is an oxidizer. If the fire reached that tank, it wouldn't just explode. It would create an oxidizer-enhanced fire that would burn with such intensity, it would cut through the ship's steel structure like a blowtorch. Normally, handling the liquid oxygen tank required a crew of 6 specially trained sailors. They would carefully valve off the tank, attach proper transfer equipment, and systematically drain it, using approved procedures. But there was no time for proper procedures. The fire was less than 20 feet away and advancing. And because the ship was at battle stations with condition zebra set, meaning all hatches and doors sealed to contain fire. Only one sailor had been able to reach his general quarters station near the oxygen tank. Seaman Robert Clark was alone. Commander Rowland's orders were clear: empty the tank overboard. Immediately. Clark looked at the tank. 750 gallons of liquid oxygen under pressure. He looked at the fire, advancing. He looked at the tank's design. There was no emergency dump valve. The system had never been designed for rapid emergency discharge. Instead, he found a more valve on the tank's lower side. He scrounged a 1-inch diameter garden hose from a nearby locker. He connected the hose to the valve, dragged the other end to the edge of the hangar deck, and opened the valve. For the next several minutes, with flames raging 20 feet away, Seaman Clark stood at his station and discharged 750 gallons of liquid oxygen safely overboard through a garden hose he'd jury-rigged in a combat emergency. His improvisation saved the ship. However, while Commander Rowland and his damage control teams fought their battles below decks, the sailors on the flight deck were facing their own desperate struggle. The specialized fire teams were dead. Chief Farrier and his trained firefighters had been killed in the first bomb explosion. What remained was chaos. Sailors with no firefighting training grabbed hoses and attacked the flames. Marines from the ship's security detachment joined the fight. Pilots who had escaped their aircraft stayed on deck and helped instead of retreating to safety. Their courage was unquestionable. Their effectiveness was limited by lack of training. Some teams sprayed water directly on fuel fires, which spread the burning fuel instead of extinguishing it. Other teams washed away foam barriers that other sailors had established. Hoses were tangled, communications were confused. Men fought the fires with determination and died because they didn't know the proper techniques. Meanwhile, the bombs continued to cook off. Sailors realized that the only way to prevent more explosions was to get the remaining ordnance off the ship immediately. But the ship lacked heavy-duty armored forklifts capable of safely moving 1,000-pound bombs across a deck covered in burning fuel and punctured by explosion craters. So, they moved the bombs manually. Sailors grabbed 1,000-pound, 750-pound, and 500-pound bombs and physically rolled them across the deck to the edge. Some bombs were so hot from the fires that the sailors' hands blistered on contact. They rolled them anyway. When bombs reached the deck edge, sailors shoved them over the side into the Gulf of Tonkin, where they sank harmlessly to the bottom. John McCain, after escaping his aircraft, went below to the hangar deck and helped ordnance crews manually jettison additional bombs from that level. His actions likely prevented additional explosions that would have claimed more lives. 3 months later, on October 26, 1967, McCain would be shot down over North Vietnam on his 23rd bombing mission and spend the next 5.5 years as a prisoner of war. But on this day, he was just another sailor fighting to save his ship. Forrestal wasn't fighting alone. The destroyer USS George K. Mackenzie maneuvered close enough to pull sailors from the water, men who had jumped or been blown overboard by explosions. The destroyer USS Rupertus, under the command of Commander Edwin Burke, executed what Rear Admiral Harvey Lanham would later call an act of magnificent seamanship. Rupertus approached Forrestal and maintained station just 20 feet away from the burning carrier, while both ships were still underway at sea. For 90 minutes, Rupertus remained locked in this position, directing her fire hoses at Forrestal's burning flight deck and hangar deck, adding her firefighting capability to the desperate battle. 20 feet separation between two ships at sea is nothing. Any miscalculation, any unexpected wave, any steering malfunction would have resulted in collision. Commander Burke held position for 90 minutes. At 11:47 a.m., 2 hours and 56 minutes after the fire started, Forrestal reported that the flight deck fire was under control. By 12:15 p.m., the flight deck fires were extinguished. However, the fires below deck, fed by burning fuel that had poured through the deck holes and spread through ventilation systems and compartments, continued burning. Fire teams fought through smoke and heat, advancing deck by deck, compartment by compartment, extinguishing fires and searching for survivors. The last fire wasn't extinguished until 4 a.m. the next morning, 18 hours of continuous firefighting. When the fires finally died, the assessment of damage revealed how close Forrestal had come to total loss. Of the 73 aircraft aboard the carrier, 21 were destroyed. 7 F-4B Phantom IIs, 11 A-4E Skyhawks, and 3 RA-5C Vigilantes. 40 more aircraft were damaged. The flight deck was punctured by multiple large holes where bombs had detonated. The hangar deck was gutted. Berthing compartments were destroyed. The damage exceeded $72 million, equivalent to more than $528 million today. But the ship survived. 134 men did not. On July 31st, Forrestal limped into Naval Air Station Cuby Point in the Philippines for emergency repairs sufficient to allow the ship to return to the United States. During the welcoming ceremonies, sailors standing in formation, trying to project normalcy. A fire alarm sounded. Crews rushed to find mattresses burning in the damaged compartments. Even in port, even after the catastrophe, the trauma continued. Meanwhile, the United States Navy had already begun its investigation. Vice Admiral Charles Booth, commander of the Atlantic Fleet Naval Air Force, ordered a manual of the Judge Advocate General investigation into the Forrestal fire on July the 30th, one day after the disaster. Rear Admiral Forsyth Massey was appointed senior member of the investigating board. The investigation was exhaustive. Investigators interviewed hundreds of witnesses. They examined wreckage. They analyzed the sequence of events second by second. They reviewed maintenance records, training records, weapons handling procedures, and communication logs. And they discovered everything that had gone wrong. The final report, released on October 18, 1967, was unequivocal in its findings. The fire was caused by an electrical surge that fired a Zuni rocket. The electrical surge occurred during a power transition. The rocket struck an external fuel tank. The fuel ignited. The bombs exploded. But the report went deeper. It examined the conditions that had made the disaster possible. The unauthorized change to pigtail connection procedures meant that TER pins were removed early, leaving rockets electrically live while aircraft were crowded on the flight deck. This deviation from standard procedure had never been approved by Captain Behling as required by regulation. The AN-M65 bombs were, in very poor condition, considered an extreme safety hazard by Captain Behling himself. The ship's ordnance officer had recommended they be jettisoned. These bombs had been stored improperly for over a decade, and contained explosive compounds more sensitive to heat than modern munitions. When they detonated in the fire, they did so faster than newer bombs would have, giving firefighters less time to respond. The investigation stated that poor and outdated doctrinal and technical documentation of ordnance and aircraft equipment and procedures, evident at all levels of command, was a contributing cause of the accidental rocket firing. Every system had failed. Procedures had been changed without authorization. Dangerous munitions had been accepted despite warnings. Training had been inadequate. Equipment had malfunctioned. And 134 men had died as a direct result. The investigation cleared Captain Belling of direct responsibility. The unauthorized procedure changes had never reached him. The electrical malfunction was unforeseeable. His decisions regarding the old bombs, while questionable in hindsight, were made under legitimate operational pressure. However, Admiral Ephraim Holmes, Commander-in-Chief of the Atlantic Fleet, disagreed. He appended a letter of reprimand to the final report, holding Belling responsible for not making more effort to confirm ordnance procedures were being followed correctly. Admiral Thomas Maurer, Chief of Naval Operations, ordered the reprimand removed. Belling was officially cleared. He even made flag rank, being promoted to Rear Admiral. But his career was over. Orders to command a carrier battle group, the pinnacle of a naval aviator's career, were cancelled by the next CNO, Admiral Elmo Zumwalt. Belling was reassigned to command of the Iceland Defence Force, a backwater posting. He retired shortly after, his career destroyed, not by official blame, but by the quiet judgment that he should have prevented the disaster somehow. The engineers who had warned about electrical vulnerabilities in weapons systems were proven right. The ordnance officer who had recommended jettisoning the old bombs was proven right. Every expert who had raised concerns about procedure changes, about training deficiencies, about equipment limitations, all proven catastrophically correct. Instead, their warnings had been documented, filed, and ignored until 134 men died. The Navy didn't just investigate, it transformed. A second investigation, led by retired Admiral James Russell, examined safety procedures across the entire carrier fleet. The Russell Report made dozens of recommendations that would reshape how the Navy operated carriers, handled ordnance, and trained sailors. The Farrier Firefighting School was established at Naval Station Norfolk, Virginia, named after Chief Gerald Farrier, who had died fighting the fire. Every sailor in the fleet would now receive comprehensive firefighting training. The Specialized Damage Control Team model, where only a select few received advanced training, was abandoned. Everyone would be trained. The Navy developed insensitive munitions, explosives designed to resist accidental detonation even when exposed to fire or shock. The old Composition B explosive that had caused the ANM-65 bombs to cook off so quickly was phased out. New bombs with thicker cases and more stable explosives would burn rather than detonate when exposed to fire, giving crews more time to fight fires and jettison ordnance. All carriers were fitted with deck wash-down systems, massive arrays of nozzles that could flood the entire flight deck with water or foam within seconds of a fire starting. Remote-controlled firefighting systems were developed so that fires could be fought from protected positions. Weapons handling procedures were completely rewritten and standardized across the fleet. No more local modifications. No more unauthorized procedure changes. Every step would be documented, approved, and trained. The film footage of the Forrestal fire, titled Trial by Fire, became mandatory viewing for every sailor entering firefighting training. The 18-minute documentary showed the actual disaster in brutal detail: the fires, the explosions, the desperate response. Sailors would watch their predecessors die on screen and learn from their sacrifice. The USS Forrestal herself survived to sail for another 26 years. After 2 years of repairs costing $72 million, she returned to service. She completed 21 deployments before being decommissioned on September 11th, 1993. But she never returned to Vietnam. The ship that had come to Yankee Station to prove the Atlantic Fleet's capability had instead become the catalyst for transforming the entire Navy's approach to safety. 18 crew members were buried at Arlington National Cemetery. The names of all 134 dead are listed on the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, where they stand alongside the combat deaths from that same war. They died not in combat, but because institutional momentum had overridden safety, because procedures had been changed without proper authorization, because dangerous munitions had been accepted rather than admit limitations. The USS Forrestal Association, formed in 1990, continues to preserve the memory of those lost. Every year at the Farrier Firefighting School, active duty personnel gather for a memorial ceremony. They present American flags representing each of the 134 sailors who died. They speak the names. They remember. And they train. They train so that the lessons purchased with 134 lives are never forgotten. Before we close, if you found this historical analysis valuable, please subscribe. The story of USS Forrestal is ultimately about the cost of institutional pressure. Captain Belling wasn't a bad officer. He was a good officer, facing impossible pressures. Prove the Atlantic Fleet's capability. Maintain operational tempo. Don't scrub missions. Don't admit limitations. Keep pace with the Pacific Fleet. The ordnance officers who warned about the bombs were right. The engineers who documented electrical system vulnerabilities were right. The investigators who would later find that procedures had been changed without authorization were confirming what safety systems had been designed to prevent. But in the moment, on July 28, 1967, when Captain Belling held that ordnance officer's report recommending the bombs be jettisoned, the pressure to maintain the mission overwhelmed the duty to prioritize safety. 21 hours later, the price was paid. 94 seconds of fire, 134 men dead, hundreds more injured, $72 million in damage, and a ship that came within minutes of capsizing and taking all 5,400 crew members to the bottom. The bombs were unstable. Everyone knew it. The ordnance officer stated it explicitly. Captain Belling considered them an extreme safety hazard, but scrubbing the mission would have required admitting that the Atlantic Fleet's flagship wasn't ready. That admission was unthinkable. So the mission continued. The bombs stayed aboard. The aircraft launched. And at 10:51 a.m. on July 29, 1967, one electrical surge proved every warning correct. The USS Forrestal fire remains the second worst loss of life on a United States Navy ship since World War II. Only the USS Liberty, attacked by Israeli forces in 1967 with 34 killed, exceeded it. The Forrestal disaster killed more American sailors than many actual combat engagements. And it was entirely preventable. Every system that failed had been documented as vulnerable. Every procedure that was changed had been designed with specific safety purposes. Every warning that was dismissed was proven accurate. The engineers were right. The ordnance officers were right. The safety procedures that were bypassed existed for exactly this reason. They were overruled by institutional momentum, by operational pressure, by the unspoken demand that admitting limitations was unacceptable. And in 94 seconds, that momentum killed 134 men.